I'm Connor Rebush, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Rebush. With me is Patrick Wyman. I should mention, as I always forget to, before we get into our episode topic today, that we are brought to you by BloodyElbow.com very happily and proudly. And today, everybody, we will be discussing counter fighters, because we talk about more than just punching on this show. But this is another installment of our Styles Make Fights series. And I believe, Pat, what have we talked about so far? We've talked, it was boxer punchers last.
We've talked boxer punchers, we've talked pressure fighters, we've talked outfighters. I believe our first installment was outfighters all the way back in March.
It was before Pettis Dos Anjos.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. And then I think that we have discussed off and on the concept of all-terrain fighters, not in a full episode. And then was it last week or the week before we talked about brawlers, but not in devoting a whole episode to them.
Didn't dedicate a whole episode. I would like to someday to talk about just the bizarreness of brawlers and maybe try to suss out. That's the thing about brawling as a type. Like, it's almost a type that defies typification. Mm-hmm. Very difficult. But today, we're going to be talking about counter fighters. I think anybody who likes combat sports, who has watched them for a while, appreciates good counters. There's a few things more beautiful to see than a perfectly timed counter punch or counter kick, counter knee, whatever. When you make the other guy miss, you make him pay. That's really kind of the essence of what finely tuned martial arts is all about. But before we get into that topic, we are going to go to the heavy bag. We have a couple of questions for you, so we will get into those right after I play this sound at you. And our two heavy bag questions today come to us from across the pond, our friends Sean Sheehan and Reese Dalbigan. And these are two questions relating to last weekend's card, which is why we wanted to do them first. We want to talk about Michael Johnson versus Beneil Dariush, which we previewed on last week's episode, and which turned out to be, I think we can both agree, a very good, technical, tactical fight, and one with a controversial ending. So we're going to have to discuss that as we discuss the way the fight itself played out. So our question from Sean reads, Patrick and Connor, which should win a round of MMA, 4+ minutes of dominance in the exchanges or a late knockdown? I think that's a bit of a veiled reference to the fight. And then we have from Reese, regarding Dariush versus Johnson, in what ways does successful takedown defense cloud our idea of success in a fight? Pat, we're going to try to answer these both at once and just discuss the fight in general in the process. So
one quick note before we hop into talking about this fight in general. If you're looking for really good, high-level technical fights, the lightweight division is the place to look.
Yeah.
It unfortunately turns out that many of these fights are clouded by controversy because there was also kind of a similar fight, maybe a little more violent, in Ayacuinta Masvidal. Mm-hmm. Really good, really high-level, really technical fight where the quality of the action was overshadowed by the decision at the end. And something similar has happened here, though this is, I gotta say, it's kind of the backlash about the decision in this fight seems absolutely insane to me. I didn't watch it live, and I saw some of the displeasure with the announcement afterwards, or with the decision afterwards. And having watched it, that seems kind of crazy to me.
We had a similar situation last week. I can't remember what the fight was, but I didn't watch it live either, and I too was a little mystified at just how vehement the backlash was. Mm-hmm. I think I had Johnson winning. But I thought it was pretty close the entire way through.
Yeah, I thought the only really clear round was the third, and that seemed like Dariush's round.
Yeah,
right?
I agree.
And the first two probably scored them for Johnson, but it wasn't. But I didn't think it was a blowout by any stretch of the imagination. And if you scored one of those two for Dariush, I don't think that you deserve to have your judge's card revoked.
No.
What was the fight where the decision was just absolutely horrendously terrible? Was it on the UFC on Fox card?
I don't know. I can't recall.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and look that up.
It does seem, by the way, that lightweight is a place for like. It's a shame that a lot of these fights get clouded by controversy when it comes to the decisions, because lightweight seems to be the place for really intriguing, like, chess matches of style matchups. We get a lot of these. I mean, even like Elias Silverio versus Rashid Magomedov. Remember that fight?
Mm-hmm.
That was a great striking battle. And lightweight, Iaquinta Masvidal, great fight. This Henderson Cerrone 3, great fight. All of these, except for the Magomedov fight, in which Magomedov was just that little bit better than Silverio, and a little more experienced and accomplished. But all the ones between guys who are more or less on the same level, they seem to end up with really close decisions. And that should speak to the quality of the matchmaking. But unfortunately, it ends up where all we talk about is how crappy the call was, rather than how great the action was. And the action in this fight was fantastic. I really thought that the matchup was spectacular. And I came away from this really, really impressed with Beneil Dariush. I mean, I do think I watching it at the time, I gave Johnson the first 2 rounds. Thought they were both relatively close, but I gave them to him. And I gave Dariush the third, but I kind of expected Dariush to get knocked out in this fight. I really expected him to have a ton of difficulty with the pressure of Johnson. I assumed, I don't know, I hope that Johnson doesn't think he is a pressure fighter now, because I don't think that it's really his strong suit. I think his adaptability is great, but if he falls into this style of always being the aggressive swarmer, crazy volume puncher, rather than countering, fighting off the back foot, being more of a boxer puncher like he was against Tibau and Joe Lozon, that would be a shame to see the loss of that, which is I think really his the best application of his skill. But I did think that we would see Johnson pressure Dariush in the same way he did Edson Barboza, considering the fact that, you know, if they watched even the slightest bit of tape, they could have gone back and seen Dariush struggling and shelling up when he was being pressured by Carlos Diego Ferreira. They could have gone back and seen him getting knocked out by Ramsey Nijum, exchanging when he shouldn't have, and thought, okay, this guy's still inexperienced. He's not a natural striker. We can go in there and pressure him. They did, and Dariush adapted the way I would expect someone with a striking background to adapt. He did not freak out. He didn't lose composure. He took some lumps, but he took them well, and he kept Johnson off, and over the course of the fight, started to pick up more and more of a lead, started to carry the momentum with that excellent jab, good footwork, defense that I would not have expected before I saw this fight. I mean, the rate at which Dariush has improved as a mixed martial artist is pretty astounding.
Yeah, well, the thing that was really interesting to me about this fight was the quality of the adaptations that each fighter made over the course of it, right? Like, one of the things that I harped on repeatedly last week when we were breaking down this fight is the fact that both Johnson and Dariush are really smart fighters. I think Dariush is incredibly cerebral. I think he's one of the smartest guys in that division. And you could see the way that he started to suss out Johnson's reactions. Like Connor, you wrote a really excellent piece on Dariush's use of the jab in this fight. You also talked about Serwan Kakai, who was in a hell of a fun fight with Frankie Saenz on the undercard. But Dariush's jab was exceptional. He jabbed like a much more experienced competitor than he actually is, and he used that to set everything else up. He used that to disrupt Johnson's rhythm when Johnson was just sliding into the edge of his striking range as he was pressuring. Dariush repeatedly disrupted it, repeatedly took away Johnson's range and his ability to throw. And Dariush did not always capitalize with power shots on that, but you could see his thought processes happening in that fight. Yeah. A lot of the time he tried to follow up with like something halfway between a stepping knee and a flying knee. That's a Rafael Cordero specialty. It's something he and all of his students teach. And then he also tried to follow up with a left uppercut. But you could see it's because he knew how Johnson was going to react, and you could see him planning his shots in accordance with it. He couldn't get them off quite fast enough because he isn't quite there yet. But you could see the improvements that he'd made. You could tell that he could see what was happening.
Yes, he proved himself to be a really adept tactician in the ring. the way that he adapted, adjusted. You could tell not all fighters do well when they think of what's going to happen next, when they are predicting and guessing and sussing things out. Not all fighters deal well with that. A lot of them, it feels like pressure. It makes them hesitate. And Dariush really impressed me with his ability to do that, especially because, like I said, just a year ago, we saw him reacting to less effective pressure less effectively. We saw him freaking out more against a less consistent striker than Michael Johnson. So he's really come a long way. And I think he kind of, with that, was able to reveal some of the limitations in Johnson's game, which I didn't really expect him to. He really kind of showed that Johnson struggles to punch while moving, particularly while moving forward. He tries to plant his feet as if he's counterpunching, where he'll stop moving in one direction and then sit down and throw. But that doesn't work so well when the other guy's moving away from you rather than moving into you. He had a lot of difficulty in covering the distance, especially when Dariush started to pick up the volume with his jab. Johnson, I mean, pretty much that entire third round, Johnson could not get past that jab. He didn't know how to stop the jab and then come in and cover the distance while Dariush himself was backing up. He had great difficulty countering Dariush in that way.
Yeah, I think it's... That was one of the things that really interested me about this fight, was the fact that it was a southpaw matchup. And as friend of the show and very, very good striking coach Stephen Wright has pointed out on many occasions, he said this about Hendricks Lawler. He coached Hendricks for both of those fights in his striking. Southpaw is not orthodox.
No,
because guys come into it with much different. When you spend your whole life fighting orthodox fighters, you develop a set of tools and a set of expectations and a set of understandings of range that have to change in a southpaw matchup.
Yeah.
And Dariush, I think probably because he trains with a shitload of southpaws, because he trains on a regular basis with Rafael dos Anjos, and other guys like that, Dariush is used to sparring southpaws. And I think that Johnson is probably not as used to that. I'm sure that he sparred with southpaws getting ready for this fight, but there's a difference in having a training camp where you spar with some southpaws to get ready to fight a southpaw, and where you're sparring with one of the best southpaw strikers in the world on a regular basis.
Yeah, Dariush has come up sparring southpaws, and he was no doubt one of the ones who was helping to prepare Dos Anjos in the gym for his fight with Pettis. He's in there with a great, dangerous southpaw every single day. So he looked a lot more comfortable with that aspect of it. Though Johnson, I think, tried to kind of override that comfort just by being as aggressive as he was. Thing is like I said, he wasn't really moving his feet while he punched all that well. He's always had a little bit of a problem with what my mentor Luis calls back foot in a bucket syndrome. He had his back foot kind of stuck out behind him. He always does, where he will kind of trail it behind him rather than stepping through so he can then cover more distance. Because if you want to close the range, you have to move your lead foot forward first. And if you want to be able to move your lead foot forward, your right foot needs to be under you, which means when you punch, you need to bring your right foot back under you as you move forward. You need to be able to kind of crab walk or shuffle your way forward as you throw. And Johnson doesn't really do that. He plants the lead foot, his right foot, or his left foot, rather, because he's southpaw. His rear foot stays behind, and then he has to reset and start again. So it's always like one quick burst. And he does that pretty well because he's so fast and he's got great timing. But against a guy who was adapting as well as Dariush was, it started to be a really serious limitation for him.
Yeah, and Dariush, see, it would have worked if like Edson Barboza, Dariush had allowed himself to get back to the fence. Like, yes. Barboza repeatedly got backed up to the fence. If Dariush had done that, then it wouldn't have been an issue that Johnson was having trouble getting his weight moving forward into his punch, getting his feet moving under him. It wouldn't have been an issue then, because Johnson could have just planted and thrown. But because Dariush consistently left himself just enough room to take a backward step and then angle out after throwing, Johnson repeatedly came up short, was repeatedly throwing it in.
He did what we said last week that Stefan Struve should have done very well, where he would stick and then use that moment of hesitation to get a little space to the side, to wiggle out, make it that much harder for Johnson to cut him off, give him that much more to think about, that much more work to do.
Yeah, and conversely, if we're talking about little issues and little problems with footwork and technique that both guys had, you could see the kind of the weakness of the Brazilian Muay Thai style kicking game in the way that Dariush was throwing his leg kicks, where he had real trouble finding the range on them. And partially that's because you tend to get everything into a kick when you throw it in the style that Brazilian Muay Thai strikers go with. You get everything moving into that shot, and it's really hard to get back to your base after you throw it. Mm-hmm. You have to you're pretty much done after you throw that. You throw it to finish a combination, or you throw it naked, but you're not following up with punches afterwards.
Yeah,
and you contrast that with the way that like Jose Aldo throws a low kick. Aldo can throw the low kick, get back to his stance, and then immediately throw punches afterwards. Where Dariush, when he managed to find his range in the third round, then he could land the low kick. But when you throw it naked from range, there's no way you can get back to your base and then immediately throw something right afterwards.
Yeah, the only Brazilian fighters who do that, I don't want to say the only, but the most notable ones who do it well are ones that also notably have backgrounds outside of Brazilian Muay Thai schools, like Dos Anjos with his training in Singapore at Evolve MMA with all of the Thai trainers there, and Jose Aldo, who has very much a Dutch style, having worked with so many Dutch kickboxing trainers and fighters. So I agree. It's kind of a commitment, and there's not a lot of focus on the retrieval of the kick or the recovery of the stance after the kick. That gave Dariush a lot of trouble. But when he boxed, he did really, really well. Let's get to our questions before we wrap up this segment. We got to make sure we kind of address what Reese and Sean are talking about here. Takedown defense. I'm going to use this Reese's question. I'll reread it for you guys at home. In what ways does successful takedown defense cloud our idea of success in a fight? I'm going to use this opportunity to take the pulpit, to take the soapbox for a moment, because I have this idea. Scoring is ultimately subjective in any combat sport, of course. Every coach will prefer different things, and so you'll see wildly varying scores over a fight, even ones that you think were very easy to score. So it's the more fights you watch, the harder it gets to really become upset over scorecards, except for ones that are truly egregious, which is why I'm not really that upset about this one. The thing about scoring is that there are always a lot of factors written into the scoring that I personally like to ignore and would like to see removed from scoring altogether. And these are basically all the factors that aren't effective offense. Because the other factors, which are I'll use the boxing scoring, I think is relatively similar in MMA. Ring generalship, or in MMA, in the UFC they call it octagon control, defense, and aggression, effective aggression. These things are useless to score in my mind. In fact, they're worse than useless because they tend to let bias creep into your scoring. Because let's go through them one by one. What is the result of effective defense? Well, the other guy misses, and so now you can hit him back while he's off balance, which is great because we're talking about counterfighters today, so we'll talk a lot more about that. So defense there is already its own reward, and its reward is effective offense. What is the result of effective aggression? Well, the only thing that makes aggression effective is offense. If you're landing strikes, getting takedowns, attempting submissions, whatever. Your aggression is useless unless it's effective, so already we should just knock it off the docket and just score effective offense. And then we have ring generalship or octagon control. What determines that you are effectively controlling the fighting space? Well, you are being more effectively offensive. You're landing more punches, you're getting better takedowns, whatever. Because if you are backing up and dancing around the whole time, but you're not getting punches off, you're not being effective. If you're doing the same thing and you're getting hit more than the other guy, you are no longer the better ring general. So if we're looking at just who has the better offense, that it's very easy to score a fight. When we start to look for who has the better ring generalship, that's the one that often gets screwed up, or defense. Then we start to look at who gets to make the opponent look worse, and that's not really how fights should be scored, right? You shouldn't be able to lose a round. Say you throw 50 punches and you only land 20, and the other guy throws 20 punches and only land 15 punches and lands every single one of them, 100% accuracy. And let's assume all those punches are of equal efficacy. They're all equally powerful and clean. So a lot of people will give the guy who threw fewer punches the round because he looked better doing it. But he shouldn't win. Just because the other guy is whiffing and swinging wild, if he's landing more, that is how you win a fight, is by hurting the other guy more than he hurts you. So
I think that people tend to forget when they run through those criteria that they're not all to be weighed equally.
I don't think
Right?
so.
Like no, I mean they're not. There's a hierarchy. Effective striking is the big one. So who hits the other guy more and harder? Effective grappling, aggression, and then octagon control. Very last. Only if the striking and the grappling are even, then should we care about aggression.
Yeah.
Only if striking, grappling, and aggression are equal, then do we look at octagon control. You don't get it doesn't matter if you're advancing if the other guy hits you 5 times as much. Unfortunately, what we know about how scoring criteria is supposed to work and how judges actually score MMA are two very different things. Like, to our listeners, if you haven't checked them out, check out Paul Gift of Bloody Elbow. His pieces on his RoboJudge pieces. So Paul has assembled a model with a shitload of data going back years and years and years and years that predicts outcomes, or that looks at fights based on how the average judge scores them. So things like a close submission attempt, judges are going to score that. Judges are going to score that more heavily than like a certain number of punches, even though that certain number of punches should always count for more than that quote unquote close submission. Like a close submission at the end of the round, you're almost certainly going to win the round regardless of what happened before that.
Yeah.
So like judging criteria, like what judges actually score and what they actually look at matter a lot less than those actual criteria. Like, you're much better off whiffing on power shots than you are sticking jabs.
Yeah.
You're much better off moving forward, whiffing on power punches than sticking and moving, retreating, and landing just a shitload of counter punches.
In boxing, I've found the exact opposite to be true. Because in boxing, you'll often hear people say, "Oh, well, it's not a barroom brawl. It's boxing. You have to box." There's now this notion. There's this long-standing notion that judges will give the round to the more aggressive guy, which they still do in MMA. But that the idea of that being a bad thing is so pervasive in boxing that everybody assumes that whoever looks slicker is winning. Like, they've reacted too much. They now have this completely revisionist view where the guy who's like slugging or brawling or even intelligently pressuring is automatically losing. Because he's missing more. He's throwing more, but not landing as much as he should. The other guy's making him look dumb, but the other guy's not hitting him back. The other guy's not punishing him for missing. So how can he be winning the round? And if I had my way, the other criteria would be removed. And if you couldn't decide who won the round based on who had the more effective offense, it would be a draw round.
Yeah, Connor, you and I had a long conversation about this off the air before we recorded last week or the week before, maybe. Because we were talking about Danny Garcia, and our conversation turned to Danny Garcia versus Lamont Peterson. Yeah. And both you and I scored that fight clearly for Danny Garcia, and there was so much backlash.
Huge backlash about the fact that he won the fight, and the scorecards were pretty good. The judges' scorecards, I think, were like people were upset that Danny Garcia won 116-112, which means, for those who don't know boxing, 8 rounds to 4, each of them a 10-9 round. That's a pretty accurate reflection of the fight. But people, some of this is clouded because people don't like Danny Garcia for a whole host of reasons, some of them deserved and some of them not. But people have this idea in boxing that the guy who's moving forward and throwing more, like he's missing, he looks clumsy, sometimes he's off balance, like he must be losing because he looks dumber than the other guy. The other guy who's not throwing back but moving around, he gets to look slick, and that's what boxing is all about, is being slick. And it sucks. It introduces, by allowing these other criteria, it introduces more bias and subjectivity into something that is already inherently subjective. If you just say, like, who hit the other guy more and who hit the other guy harder, that's all you should ask. That's, to me, that obviously MMA is a little more varied because of, the wider variety of scoring techniques. But so to get to Reese's question, successful takedown defense, I think, is the reason that a lot of people thought Johnson dominated this fight against Dariush. He stopped every single one of his takedowns. That's great. What did he do with it? Not really a damn thing.
Yeah, it's not like he did the Yoel Romero thing where he stuffs the shot, grabs a front headlock, and then just beats 7 shades of shit out of you while he's holding on to it. That is or Robbie Lawler's thing where he sprawls you so hard that he slams Roy McDonald's head into the canvas. Like, I can see giving some points, some style points for that, you know?
Yeah, I mean, people said this like, well, Dariush wanted the fight one place, and he wanted, and Johnson wanted it on the feet, and he got to have the fight where he wanted it. That's cool, but he didn't even necessarily win the fight where he wanted it. So I don't understand why you should just. And also, isn't that a lot of subjectivity? Maybe Dariush didn't want the takedowns as badly as it seemed. Maybe he was trying to put the idea of the takedown in Johnson's head so he could throw those knees and uppercuts that he went to so often.
Well, that was a huge deal in the Iaquinta Masvidal fight, right? And people were saying that there was a whole school of thought saying, well, Masvidal stuffed all of Iaquinta's takedowns. Well, Iaquinta wasn't looking for takedowns. He was grabbing a leg and then letting go so he could throw high while Masvidal's hands were down.
Yeah.
Like,
it's a Frankie Edgar thing. Frankie Edgar does that very well. And he shouldn't be losing rounds because he gets his takedown stuffed, because half of Frankie Edgar's game is getting his takedown stuffed. So I don't know. It's like saying that a guy who lands a lot to the body, those don't really count for much because the shots he threw to the head to set them up didn't land because they got the guy's hands to come up. Right? Like, well, maybe I was throwing high to get his hands to come up. Maybe my goal was the body, and I wanted to get his hands out of position to block those shots. You can't place too much idea into. That's just why I don't like ring generalship. I think it's bullshit. I think it's a bullshit thing that allows you to just basically decide whoever you like more is winning.
Yeah, I'm with you there. So to answer Reese's question, yes, successful takedown defense does seem to matter quite a bit to fan scoring. I'm not sure it matters so much to actual judges.
It didn't seem to matter that much. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I present for the record the ultimate example of this: Martin Kampmann versus Diego Sanchez, which that actually was a robbery. But Kampmann didn't deserve to win the fight because he stuffed all 15 of Sanchez's takedowns. He deserved to win the fight because he beat the living shit out of Diego Sanchez.
Yeah. Here's my I said before we began recording that I would have a hot take for this episode. And I've gone back and rewatched it, and I think Phil Davis beat Lyoto Machida. And that's the hard thing, is at the time I was also espousing this opinion. Before I'd really thought about it, I was like, well, yeah, it's because I wanted Machida to win, you know. So afterwards, I was like, I felt he was winning. I'm a big fan of Machida. Everybody knows that. And I was like, okay, well, he stuffed the takedown, so obviously he was doing something successful, and Davis was being unsuccessful in those takedowns. But you don't win or lose a fight because you're being unsuccessful, and you don't win a fight just by stopping the other guy from doing what he wants to do. If I block all of your punches but don't throw any back, I don't get to win the round. You know what I mean? You probably win it just because I'm still absorbing some force through my gloves. You're still going at me. And so, like, if a guy's coming at you, he doesn't look pretty, he's not being very successful, but you're being less successful, you know, like, I don't think percentages matter all that much. I think that just flat data is how rounds should be scored. And not punch stats. Fuck punch stats. I hate people who bring up statistics after the fact and say, well, he landed such and such punches. Why don't you go back and count them and then tell me how many he landed? Because
that I actually do. Like, I count strikes.
I've done it before,
as I watch fights, and I find it to be a useful thing. Like,
yeah.
But yeah, and so to answer Sean's question, I think we would be silly to Sean's question: what should win a round of MMA? 4+ minutes of dominance in the exchanges or a late knockdown? I think we would be silly to expect judges not to weigh what happens at the end of a round more heavily. Mm-hmm. We know that that's just a thing that they're going to do, and I'm not necessarily sure that they're wrong in doing that.
No.
But if it's 4+ minutes of dominance versus a flash knockdown, not sure that necessarily describes the first round of Dariush-Johnson, but 4+ minutes of dominance should absolutely win you that. Like, because the classic example of this would be Jędrzejczyk and Gadelha, where Gadelha won the first 4 minutes of that fight, right? Like, almost certainly won the first 4 minutes of the first round of that fight, but then Jędrzejczyk, with about 15 seconds left, just knocks her flat on her ass and nearly finishes her at the end of that round, and everybody scored the round for Jędrzejczyk. Well, Gadelha landed more shots prior to that. Gadelha took her down before that. Like, there was an argument to be made that despite the late knockdown, Gadelha still won that round.
Yeah, I agree with you. Absolutely.
So we know that this is a thing that happens. Like, if you knock somebody down in the last 15 seconds or last 30 seconds or even the last minute of a round, you're probably going to win it.
Yeah.
Still, it should not necessarily.
Yeah, and as to the question, there's nothing you kind of just have to say it's got to be subjective. You know, you have to weigh the severity of the knockdown. Is it a flash knockdown where they're off balance and they pop back up, like the first knockdown in Aldo Mendez 2? Or is it like, are they staggering around and they've dominated the round, but then they're staggering and badly hurt? Then, that all comes into play. And again, subjectivity is what makes judging such a frustrating thing. And you have to sympathize with the judges for having to do it. So we've talked about this long enough. We're going to take a break here, and just fair warning, this is going to be a long episode. We kind of decided a while back that all of the Styles Make Fight episodes are going to be just a little bit long. We're not going to worry about the time limit so much because these are for the hardcorest of the hardcore fans. So when we come back, we are going to talk about counter fighters as a type. What makes one a counter fighter? What can you expect to see in good examples of this style type? What are the different types of counters? And much, much more after this break. Okay, wait, stop. Don't skip this break. I know you skip most of them. It's a podcast. It's not a radio show. You don't have to listen to the commercials. But if you follow my very simple instructions, you'll be doing a huge service to Heavy Hands, Pat, and myself. First, go to Stitcher.com or iTunes.com. You can use either of those services to subscribe to the show, which makes it really, really easy to listen to every episode and not have to go hunting for it on our confusing, badly designed website. Once you're there, give us a positive rating and a positive review. That means go to the little 5-star thing and click on the star all the way to the right. That's a 5-star rating. That's the best one you could possibly give us, and like 20 or 30 words about how you enjoy the show. It may not seem like much, but it's a huge help to us, and we really appreciate it. It helps us bring Heavy Hands to an ever-increasing audience, which is just good for everybody. So thank you for listening. Please take the time to give us a positive rating and review. Next time that you're on at your computer, at your phone, whatever, iTunes.com, Stitcher.com, search for Heavy Hands, give a positive rating and a review. Thank you. And now, back to the show. And we are back. Our topic for today, even though we spent half an hour discussing our heavy bag questions there, our main topic for today is counter fighters. And we were... Well, I was going to say we were lucky enough to see. I'm not sure if we were super lucky, and certainly the counterfighters themselves weren't that lucky. Last weekend, we had a couple of pure counterfighters performing pretty miserably overall on the UFC card, and those were Ovince St. Preux and Sam Alvey. And OSP and Alvey stand out because MMA is a sport in which you don't really find a lot of pure counterpunchers, a lot of fighters who really espouse that mentality of, what I really want to do is hit this guy while he's trying to hit me. What I really want to do is wait and set traps and spring them at just the right moment to land that big punch or that big sequence of punches. It's a very rare type in this sport. And maybe we kind of saw why, with how much difficulty both of these guys had. Sorry if I'm spoiling it for you, but they both lost, and they were both stopped. Why do you think they lost, Pat, and why do you think this type is so rare in mixed martial arts?
Well, it's rare in combat sports in general. It takes a rare willingness, it takes a rare patience and a rare willingness to just kind of hang around and wait for your opponent to come to you. It's a rare personality trait to be able to do that. But I think it's especially rare in MMA because I think it's less viable in MMA. Mm-hmm. You need to, first of all, it takes a tremendous amount of experience and the kind of intangibles of striking in terms of your control of the distance, your understanding of range, your timing, especially skills that only come with a long years and years and years of practice. So, and few guys in MMA are going to get comfortable enough with their counter striking where they can really make that work. But also volume. Volume is harder to come by in MMA than it is in other combat sports. So you're basically inviting yourself to lose decisions on volume if you're not that much better than your opponent. Like Anderson Silva is probably the clearest example of a counterpuncher in MMA, and he was really more of a pure outfighter who, as time went on and as he got older and got better and better and better, where he could be a counterpuncher because he was that much more skilled than his opponents.
Yeah, and almost that it was almost like he moved less, like he had less spring in his step as he got much older, near the very tail end of his career. Did a lot of waiting and like where he needed the other guy to come at him to hit them, whereas early in his career he did not need that. He was happy to run around the ring and chase them if he even needed to.
Yes, absolutely. And, there are very few guys in MMA who can throw enough volume to win a decision while still being pure counterpunchers at heart. And I think part of the issue is part of the issue there is that MMA judges do not do a good job of seeing counterpunches.
Yeah.
It is hard. Apparently, it's just they don't see them very well. And I brought up Diego Sanchez versus Martin Kampmann earlier. Kampmann beat the crap out of Sanchez, but he did it off the back foot. He threw a lot of backstepping counterpunches, a lot of step back, plant his feet and throw counters. And really, he beat up Sanchez off his back foot. Sanchez largely won that fight on aggression and failed takedown attempts. Now we saw this at the tough Brazil, the one of the two tough Brazil finales at UFC 190. Delano Lopez, who is a pure counterpuncher. That's really what he wants to do.
And a counter wrestler.
And counter wrestle you too. So it extends not just to his striking, but also to his wrestling and grappling games. Which is an interesting kind of point there.
And he's kind of, as far as submission grappling, he's kind of a set you up and catch you in transition submission grappler too, which is kind of the submission artist's version of a counterpuncher.
Yes, exactly. Eric Silva, similar kind of game to him. But with Lopez, I thought Lopez pretty clearly took 2 rounds of that fight. But again, I don't think the judges see counterpunches very well. And in Lopez's case, it's even more bizarre because he's one of the few guys who has a quick trigger. So he's going to be throwing 2, 3, 4, 5 shots when he gets his opportunity. Unlike Ovin St. Preux or Sam Alvey, OSP is going to throw 1 shot at a time on the counter. Alvey maybe 2, maybe 3 at most.
Yeah.
So you get these big gaps in volume between them and their opponents. Lopez, there was maybe a small gap in output, but I thought he threw just as much.
I think so. Yeah, it was a strange fight. And I think everyone was so uninterested in it, they didn't care about the decision. It wasn't like this high-profile Johnson-Dariush decision where there was a lot of uproar. Everyone's like, whatever, it's tough Brazil. But I agree with you. I think he should have won the fight. And I think I think you're right as far as volume is concerned. Definitely in the game of a guy like OSP, that is what is lacking. I think OSP really, really struggles. First of all, he makes strange decisions. He still fights like he's inexperienced or like he's not getting the right kind of training to improve. So he will just let bizarre things happen to him, like just get mounted and then like strike off of his back or give up his back from mount rather than trying to hip out and get back to half guard, where he can then get a technical stand-up. He just does weird things. So that is what it is. But as far as his game on the feet is concerned, he's pretty good as far as he hits with power. He moves out of the way relatively well. He's fairly precise, but he throws 1 strike at a time every single time. It's very much the thing I've complained in the past about regarding Jackson Winklejohn fighters, where they will throw one thing and then throw another thing and then throw another thing with like 2 or 3 seconds at least spaced in between these different attacks. And they expect you to be such an inexperienced striker or to wait on them so much that you're just not going to be able to tell what the next thing is. You know what I mean? Like if we're standing 5 feet apart and you throw a front kick at my stomach and it lands, and then you throw a Brazilian kick 5 seconds later, the expectation is that I'm just going to reach for the front kick because I think that's what's going to hit me again because it just hit me before. But there's no pressure being put on me. Like, I have just as much initiative as you. So it becomes pretty easy for me, if I know what I'm doing, to read what you want to do to me. You have to take that initiative and that ability to time and predict away from me by throwing in combination. So instead of me throwing a single jab and then a single hook, I want to hit you with a jab and then another one, and then I want to flash the jab and then throw the hook around when you try to parry it. I want to get you so that you're not thinking, you're just reacting. And then my setups can really, really work because you're just doing what you feel, and what you feel isn't always the best solution.
Yeah, and one thing I realize we kind of neglected to mention this at the beginning of the segment. Every type of fighter should be able to counter. Counter fighters are not the only people who throw counters. Pressure fighters throw counters. In fact, there's as we talked about, there is a subset of pressure fighters who are really counter punchers, the aggressive counter fighter. But they do all of their best work moving forward. They force you to throw at them, and then they counter you back. Like Anthony Johnson is a clear example of this. Ross Pearson is another guy who likes to do that.
It's pressure fighters with very good timing, but without the patience of pure counterpunchers.
Yes, precisely. But a pure counter fighter is something else entirely. A pure counter fighter, in terms of the distance that they like to operate at and their and where they like to be in the cage, a pure counter fighter is closest to an out fighter. I think there's a lot of bleed over between those two types, and as you get more, as outfighters get more skilled, and as they age, I think a lot of them turn into counterpunchers, because because you can't work at the pace that you used to. You can't move quite as much as you used to. And it just, all of those things get harder for you. So you compensate by honing your counter.
And I think the experience matters there too, because I think one of the things that stands out, we've talked a lot about how outfighters are kind of typified by a lack of confidence or composure, like a lack of desire to hang out in a place where they might be disadvantaged. Most outfighters we look at are not fighters who like to hang out in the pocket or in the mid-range. They like to be all the way in or all the way out. They like to be dictating that range and deciding where the fight takes place and making sure that you're not ever getting over on them. They always want to have that higher ground. And that can go away with time. You have a lot of experience against high-level opponents. You are going to become more confident no matter what kind of opponent you're facing. And I think that's kind of why counterfighters are so rare. Because we mentioned how they're very rare in MMA. They're rare even in boxing. There are not many fighters who you could look at and say, yeah, that guy's definitely a pure counterpuncher. Like, that's what he really wants to do. And I think it's the patience combined with that level of confidence. You have to be confident enough in your ability to hurt the other guy that you could be a boxer puncher, but laid back and patient enough that you are not going to go after the opponent when the action starts to lull like boxer punchers start to do. You have to, which is why two counterpunchers fighting are almost always horrible, boring fights.
Yes.
Both guys waiting.
It's also, like, I mean, I really think it's difficult to overstate how rare a character trait that kind of patience is.
Yes.
And I think the same, it's like it's like the reverse side of the coin of pressure fighting, where it's also not easy to be a pure kind of pressure fighter where you're just constantly moving forward and constantly moving forward and constantly moving forward, which is why, like, the boxer puncher, kind of the jack of all trades of fighting, like, a lot of the time it's hard for them to sustain a pressure game plan for all that long. Yeah. Like, we saw this with Chad Mendez when he fought Jose Aldo. We saw this with Canelo Alvarez when he fought Erislandy Lara. That it's hard to maintain a mindset that you're not necessarily all that comfortable with, and to sit back and counter, to wait for the action to come to you, to feel like you're not in control, that you're not going to be able to dictate the pace that the action is happening at, that you're not going to have the initiative to just give that up, is an incredibly difficult thing for most fighters to do.
I haven't done the research. I don't have the statistics to back this statement up, but I'm almost inclined to say that most people with the necessary level of patience don't become fighters. These are the guys who are not going to be happy with the analogy of boxing or fighting being like chess. Instead, they're just going to play chess. You know what I mean? I don't think that patience is really something that you expect to find in somebody who wants to do violence for a living.
Yeah. That's a really good point. That's a really good point.
It's just a really cerebral kind of quiet, patient style. And this is why we saw this, for example, in Sam Alvey's fight. Pressure fighters, real swarmers, even just brawlers, because what Derek Brunson did to Sam Alvey was pretty much a brawler's game plan, which is to brawl. He went in there and just went bananas. And that's very, very difficult for a counterpuncher to deal with. Counterpunchers tend to do quite well against boxer punchers, even against boxers, if they can get the boxer to come forward. And sometimes against pressure fighters, but it's the swarmers and the brawlers, the ones who just throw so much volume at them. If you think of a boxer, of a counterpuncher's brain, a counterfighter's brain as a computer, then the swarmer or the brawler is the fighter who throws so many equations at that computer at once. It's like a DOS attack. There's just too much data for them to figure out. And so Sam Alvey, who likes to fight at a relatively slow pace, who's happy to take shots as long as he can kind of let each one be a little bit of data that tells him what the next shot might be, where the next opening might be. It's a nightmare for him to face somebody who does what Derek Brunson did, which is just to stand in front of him and swing over and over and over, sometimes right, left, right, sometimes kicking, sometimes grabbing and punching, sometimes throwing elbows, just all over the place, too close, too fast, too much to tell what's going to happen and piece out those openings. And he tried, he gave it his best shot. He tried to sneak in those counters, but Brunson came in and made a very smart, despite fighting in like he was a crazed orangutan. It was, in fact, a very smart strategic decision to just overwhelm the patient counterpuncher in Sam Alvey.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely the case. I mean, you've got to, it's not a coincidence that so much of what Anderson Silva did in the cage was predicated on giving himself space and time.
Yeah.
And so we've talked extensively about his habit of planting himself outside of striking range and moving his head forward to make his opponent think that he was in range. But you got to remember, in combat sports, space is time, right? So if you can give yourself that space, if your footwork is good enough to keep yourself out in the middle, and to maintain the distance between the two of you, that's going to slow the pace of the fight, slow it down substantially, and that's what a counterpuncher wants. The problem is, in MMA, if you have guys who can slow the pace that much, if they only pop off with a shot or two at the very most at a time, it's so easy for them to get buried under a very limited amount of volume. Yeah. This is the problem with Ovince St. Preux, too, is a guy who, best case scenario, is only going to throw 8 or 10 strikes a minute. If he gets taken down, even if he immediately scrambles back to his feet, he's lost 15 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds a minute.
Which is for him a very considerable chunk of time, given his volume.
Like, that's enough right there, where even if the other guy just matches you in volume, if he doesn't land anything big, he's going to lose that round. Mm-hmm. So there are way more ways in MMA, I think, as opposed to boxing and as opposed to kickboxing, for you to lose rounds on output and volume as a pure counterpuncher. Like part of the reason I liked Dilano Lopez as a fighter and still do is because I thought he'd kind of solved that by always throwing 3 or 4 or 5 shots at a time when he's got that trigger going. And John Lineker will occasionally go into kind of an aggressive counter mode. Lineker, when he's countering, is throwing long-ass combinations. Yeah. His trigger is sharp, but it's not just that he throws one shot, it's that he throws 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 John Linekers.
Yeah, it increases it does 2 things for you to throw in volume like that. And we'll talk about Juan Manuel Marquez later in this episode, of course. Probably the best pure counterpuncher in boxing now. And an interesting case, somebody who has successfully had their innate style changed into that of a counterpuncher. But Lopez is very much like Marquez. He's obviously not on the same level of accomplishment, but in terms of style, Marquez is well known not only for being a counterpuncher, but for being a tremendous combination puncher who always throws in combination. The only thing he doesn't always throw in combination is his jab. If he throws another punch, there's always something else ready to follow it up. Unless it is the last punch of a 3 or 4 punch combination. And what that does for you is 2 things. First of all, it increases the chances that you are going to land one of your counters, which is just basically the main reason you should punch in combination no matter what your style is. If you're throwing punches, you want to increase the chances as the combination goes along that one of those punches will land cleanly and do damage. So if your first uppercut misses, it's okay because the guy's head's come up and now you can try your left hook. If he ducks under that, it's all right because now your next uppercut might catch him on the way down. You're basically taking the initiative away from him bit by bit and hoping you can catch up to his reactions. So it makes you a more effective counterpuncher. The other thing is that it's one of those things where if you're not gifted with crazy punching power, it helps you to slow the pace down to the pace that you want as a counterpuncher. If you're throwing a lot of volume, you're giving the other guy a lot of things to think about, where even if all those punches aren't landing, you are at least slinging enough leather back at him that he can't just walk through. You're not trying to counter him with a single jab, which he knows if he slips that jab, he can get in on you and hit you some more, or take you down or whatever. So it's really good for counterpunchers in particular, counter strikers in particular, to learn to throw in combination. I think it is an absolutely essential thing, and I think that's why guys like Sam Alvey struggle when they step up in competition, why a guy like OSP struggles so much with somebody who's versatile and dangerous like Glover Teixeira, or even like Ryan Bader. It's very difficult for them to, OSP has moments where he looks great, but it's just not a consistent approach to fighting. And as a counterpuncher, you are innately inconsistent, so you have to do as much as you can to bring consistency to a style that is really completely based on what the other guy wants to do. If you're going to let the other guy determine what happens in the fight, which is kind of the backbone of being a counterfighter, you have to keep as much of the fight in your own control, in your own possession, as you possibly can.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of unfortunate that MMA presents these kinds of challenges for pure counter fighters, because there's a lot more like adding in takedowns and full on clinch fighting. You have more opportunities in MMA to land a wider variety of counters. So, we're starting to see more use of counter knees, counter stepping knees, and counter uppercuts and things like that. There are a lot more opportunities available to the pure counter fighter than there are in boxing. Like there are ways to do that and ways to be effective doing that, but we just see so few who can effectively work that way.
Yeah, it's a sad thing, especially because I think everyone can kind of agree. Like I said this at the start of the show, if you watch combat sports, you may be drawn in first by the crazy violent fighters, but everybody reaches a point of fandom where they really appreciate the beauty of a perfectly timed counterattack. In MMA, there is nothing more picturesque than a counter blast double. When the guy runs into you and you just slam your shoulder into his hips, you take him off his feet effortlessly and run him halfway across the cage. In boxing, there's nothing more beautiful than slipping a guy's punch and hitting him, and he just runs right into it. Those are the things where it seems like mind control. Like that's the closest you get to a martial arts movie, to a kung fu movie happening in real life.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, I maintain the single most perfect strike I've seen in an MMA fight is the counter knee that Joe Duffy hit on, I think his name is Julian Bossuge in Cage Warriors. The most perfectly timed counter knee you will ever see in your entire life. As Bossuge changed levels and ducked in for a takedown, Duffy just cracked him. One shot KO. Put him clean out with that. But I just thought everything about it is literally perfect. Yep. Like I could watch that GIF on repeat forever.
And if you look through like any top 10 list of greatest boxing knockouts, I guarantee you like 60% of those at least are going to be counterpunches. Mm-hmm. That's when you get the cleanest knockout, is when a guy runs into your punch or when you hit him while he's punching. I mean, here, I'm going to look at a list right now. This is from expertboxing.com, and I haven't looked at this list before. But let's see what these top 10 boxing knockouts are. Manny Pacquiao versus Ricky Hatton. That's a counterpunch. Kostya versus Zab Judah. That one is not. Tommy Hearns versus Roberto Duran. That one is not. Jackson versus Harold Graham. Julian Jackson versus Harold Graham. That one is. Buster Douglas versus Mike Tyson. That one's not. Marquez Pacquiao 4. That one is. Martinez Paul Williams. That one is. Rocky Marciano, Jersey Joe Walcott. That one's not. But you know what I mean? Like the vast majority of these really big ones, Mike Tyson, Michael Spinks, that one is. The ones that we remember the most are the counterpunches. So you want to see the perfect counters. You want to see this perfect distillation of this perfect culmination of power and athletic ability with experience and technique and timing. It's everything you want. And so it's a shame that we don't have more great counter fighters in MMA.
Well, and think about, some of the iconic knockouts in MMA history were also counter punches. Junior Dos Santos on Gilbert Yvel. That was a counter punch. Yep. Junior rolls under the right hand and comes upstairs with the left hook. Anderson Silva on Carlos Newton, one of the first well-known flying knee knockouts in MMA. That was a counter to Newton's takedown. Mm-hmm. Anderson Silva, Forrest Griffin. That was
those were all counters.
Yeah, all of those knockdowns were counters in that fight. I think that it is the landing the perfect counter is the peak of what makes striking in combat sports great.
And the style built around that. How can you not like that?
Yeah, and so I think we should probably take a break. But in the next segment, we'll break down some of those types of counters.
Yes,
because there are many different kinds of counters, and to be a true counterpuncher, you need to be more or less adept in all of those. Whereas if you're a fighter in another style, may have only one or two types of counters that they're really comfortable with.
Absolutely. And in addition to that, naturally, we're going to give some examples of some of history's best counterpunchers for you guys to use as a little homework. You want to watch some fights at home, and for us to discuss, because, like I said, we love counterfighters. So we will discuss that after this break. Okay, so here's another way you can help us out. Go to your couch, lift up the cushions, and scrounge around in the creases for change, lint, like bent paper clips, like a thumbtack that you stab your thumb on and then you scream alone in your living room. Throw all the stuff out except the change. All right, now take that and deposit it into your bank account or your PayPal account. Head over to heavyhandspodcast.com and click on the donate button on the right side of your screen. Whatever money you just found, which you weren't using anyway, send it to us, all right? Because Pat and I will use it. That money helps us keep this show on the air and free of charge, which is great for you. It's great for us because that way we're making a little bit of money. The donations are a huge deal for us. So please go to heavyhandspodcast.com. Any spare change that you might have lying around, hit the donate button on the right side of the screen and send it our way to help us keep this show live. Thanks. And now back to Heavy Hands. All right, Pat. So types of counters. You mentioned earlier, and this needs reiteration. Every style of fighter should be able to counter strike, counter wrestle, whatever your milieu is. You should be able to counter the opponent. Everyone should be learning to do these things. You want to be able to make the other guy miss. You want to be able to make him pay after you do that. But the counter fighter has all of these in his arsenal. The well-trained counter fighter should, in any case. And if you want to look for what counter fighters really do well as a type, you have to kind of understand the full breadth of the counter striking arsenal. I tend to think mostly in terms of counter punches. People who listen to this show regularly know that, of course, it's mainly a striking show. That's what Pat and I, that's our bread and butter. But this applies to everything. The different, and basically the different schools of counters come down to the timing of those counters. When they happen in relation to the technique that you are using, in relation to the thing you are countering, right?
Yeah. So we've talked before about the concept of rhythm in combat sports, and that is kind of an integral thing to understanding counters.
Yes.
So basically, counters fall into three basic categories. First, you have same time counters. You are hitting your opponent exactly as he's throwing.
Yes.
Then the second category are half beat counters. So a good example of this would be catching your opponent's jab on your glove and then throwing back. That is a half beat counter. Yep. It only takes a half a beat to do that.
The rhythm is catch jab. Yep. You're catching and you're throwing back almost just after you catch.
Yeah, or you come out, or you let your right hand drift out just a little bit. You brush your opponent's jab to the side, which loads your hips just a tiny little bit, and then you come back with a left hook. That would be a half beat counter. What we're most familiar with in terms of counters, I think, are full beat counters. So this would be where your opponent throws a left hook, you roll under the left hook, and you come up with a right hand. That's a full beat counter. Or if for our kickboxers out there, somebody throws a jab at you, you scoop their hand down and load your hips back to the right side and come back with a right low kick. That is a full beat counter.
Yeah.
A caught kick counter would be a full beat counter. I think if we want to expand this to MMA, a reactive takedown would be a full beat counter, because you have on the half beat, you change levels, and then the second half beat, you drive through and explode into the double leg.
Sometimes they can be same time. Sometime.
It can be, that's true, yeah.
If you feint a guy and you get him to punch at you and you run through him while he's punching, there are some of the most beautiful counter takedowns are the same time ones.
This is true. But yeah, so I think so we can the point being, we can fit just about any kind of counter movement into one of these three categories.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And let's kind of talk about what the advantages and disadvantages are of each.
Okay.
I think same time counters are often the most devastating. For obvious reasons. If you want to, if you make a guy miss and then you hit him, whether it's a half beat or a full beat, no matter what the amount of time is after he misses, you are increasing the chances that he may be able to recover or do something to defend himself, get his hand back in position, duck his head, step back, something. Same time counter is dangerous for the reason that you're increasing your chances of catching the guy as he's committing his weight. So not only is he physically out of position more often than not, he's also mentally unprepared. If a guy is worried about hitting you in the face, he's not thinking about being hit in the face at the same time. His mind is not focused on defense. And so you tend to catch guys off guard with these. The classic example, of course, is the cross counter. If somebody throws a jab at you and you throw your right hand at the same time, you'll duck your head inside the jab, slip to the inside of the jab, and bring the right hand over the top. This is a great counter to use against somebody who steps in hard with their jabs, who really tries to put weight behind them, because you're going to catch them moving their head into you. And the same thing works for a right hand. Somebody who really falls into their right hand, you can slip outside the right hand and throw your own right in the same movement. Chad Mendes did that to Ricardo Lamas a little while back. Despite hitting him on top of the head, the collision was impactful enough, him and Lamas moving together into one another, that it put Lamas completely out of sorts.
Yeah, I think that's the a couple components there with the same time counters. Yeah, they're absolutely not. They're not seeing it coming. The most devastating punches are the ones that you don't see coming. But also, but as you pointed out there, you touched on this, Connor. They're moving into the shot, and this is why like counter uppercuts are so devastating. It's why counter knees are so devastating in MMA and in MMA, Muay Thai, kickboxing. I think especially in MMA because the level changes are so much more drastic. They're so much more noticeable.
Level changes, yeah.
Yeah, so that's why I keep harping on the counter knees, but they're my favorite kind of strike. They're my favorite kind of strike. Period. But I think they have a special utility in MMA, and that's why they're so devastating. They are inherently a same time counter.
Yeah.
So to give some examples of guys who specialize in same time counters, I think Paul Felder to me is the example that stands out right now, simply because he's been fighting a lot.
Yeah.
But Paul Felder was repeatedly trying to land same time counters against Edson Barboza. His stepping knee is a same time counter. That counter right hand that he likes is a same time counter. He throws a lot of those, even though he is not really what I would call a pure counter fighter.
And I think Chad Mendez, who I mentioned before, is a great one, though he also has the halftime counters that he likes to throw a lot. And then Lyoto Machida, not always a counter puncher, but when he counter punches, it's almost always a same time counter. He is running you into something. He's creating a collision. That's kind of the central principle of his game.
I just pictured Ryan Bader falling real
poor funny. Ryan Bader. Clang, to borrow Joe Rogan's very apt phrase during that knockout.
Why when I think about that fight is it not just that I think of Ryan Bader? I always think poor Ryan Bader.
It's not.
Every single time I think of that fight, I think poor Ryan Bader.
Yeah, it was like I don't know, man. You don't ever want to be the other guy's highlight reel. Like, you don't want to be the demonstration of how much better the other guy is than you. You don't want to be like the reason everybody thinks the other guy's great.
Yeah, this is absolutely true. So does that about cover same time counters? Is there? I
think so.
One more example that I was thinking of here. Counter kicks. You can throw kicks as same time counters. So you often see this again with a guy who steps in really hard with his jab. There are a few guys who will throw really hard low kicks right as a guy puts his weight down
while pulling their head off line.
Mm-hmm. We saw that from Edson Barboza we've seen that from Edson Barboza a lot, but he did it to Paul Felder. When Felder would step in behind that jab, as soon as Felder put his weight down on it, Barboza was chopping away with the low kick.
You see this from Marlon Moraes a lot as well.
Yep.
A World Series of Fighting Bantamweight champion. Great counter kicker. Counter kicking is difficult because you're compromising your position. And it's difficult to move backwards and kick at the same time. Very difficult. And a lot of times you have to be able to punch on the back step if you're trying to counter punch. So counter kickers are a special and talented breed, and they're always very fun to watch. I think that also, we have to mention the disadvantage of relying on the same time counters, which is that you're kind of putting yourself in the same boat as your opponent. If you're trying to create a collision, you may be collided with yourself. When Lyoto Machida got knocked out by Shogun Rua, he fell prey to the same forces that he was trying to create. He ran into Shogun's right hand. And that's a very difficult thing to have to deal with. So you have to really, really have confidence in your counter and know what risks you're putting yourself in, because you may just also be hit in the middle of the exchange.
Yeah, and that's why the very best same time counter punchers are always pulling their own head off line as they're throwing.
Oh yes,
right. So we see that, like, Chad Mendez always pulling his head off line as he's throwing a same time counter. Paul Felder always pulling his head off line as he throws the same time counter. A guy you turned me on to, boxer, now deceased, Salvador Sanchez, when he was throwing same time counters against Wilfredo Gomez, always pulling his head offline. His head never stayed on the center line as he was throwing.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about Sanchez and a few other examples a little later, because he definitely deserves discussion. One of my favorite counter punchers to watch. But let's move on. Halftime counters. Halftime counters are good because they kind of deal with that risk inherent to the same time counters right off the bat. It's kind of a compromise, I guess. You are defending yourself, making sure that your defense is taken care of before responding with the attack of your own, but still responding quickly enough that you're hopefully catching the guy while he's still off balance, while he's still committing his weight. So a catch jab is a great example of this. First of all, anybody at home who is getting into boxing or whatever, I highly recommend you do a lot of practicing on catching and jabbing, or parrying and jabbing, whatever your preference may be. but on putting your hand on the other guy's jab and responding with one of your own. Because even if you don't land this counter, it tells you exactly how far away the other guy is. Because you know if he can touch your hand, he's close enough to hit you. Which means you have to keep your hand close to your chin when you catch your parry. That's all comes down to technique. But a catch jab is my favorite example of a halftime counter because it's just so concise. It's quick, it's basic, and it's absolutely necessary to start measuring the distance and start gauging your opponent. Where he will throw his jab, you'll twist your body slightly, your glove comes in front of your chin, you catch, and you follow back with the jab of your own. It's catch jab, ba-doom, ba-doom. It's like two completely interconnected movements, but one right after the other.
Yeah, it's. I think halftime counters are interesting. You tend to see a lot of them in Dutch style systems.
Yeah.
And related things. Anything where you get a lot of partner drilling. I think partner drilling is probably the best way to teach halftime counters. Because you get used to your opponent's glove touching your glove and then you immediately firing back.
Yeah.
That's really, I think, the only effective way to teach them. But you see a lot of them in Dutch style. They have a wide variety of kind of half beat counters with little like short motion brush aside counters that do not fully commit your body, but load your hips just enough so that you can come back with them. So in MMA, Henry Hooft trained fighters. I think especially Anthony Johnson loves himself a halftime counter.
Yeah.
Michael Johnson against Beneil Dariush threw a ton of half-beat counters in that fight, playing a lot as he was trying to time Dariush's jab. When Dariush started throwing a lot of jabs, Johnson did not have a ton of success with them, but that's what he was trying to do, was to brush the jab aside or throw a little tight slip in there and then come back with the left hand. Those were really a lot of half-beat counters. Dwayne Ludwig's guys TJ Dillashaw throws a lot of half-beat counters.
I saw a lot of half-beat jab counters in Robbie Lawler versus Rory McDonald.
Yeah, that's another really good example. A lot of the Nova União fighters, who all more or less fall under the Dutch style rubric, love a halftime counter. Claudia Gadelha against Jessica Aguilar. Gadelha was eating Aguilar up with half-beat counters because she would, as soon as Aguilar's glove touched hers, because when Gadelha was shelled up like that, Gadelha was immediately firing back. Those were all half-beat counters.
Yeah, and this guy's a limited fighter, and it probably stands out to me in his skill set because it's all he really does well. But Curtis Stevens, great puncher, hits very hard, and basically his whole game is built on what Paulie Malignaggi would call a catch and shoot, which is where you will, basically very much like a catch and jab, except it usually pertains to blocking a punch. So if the other guy throws a right hand, you'll block it with your left hand, the hand that's on the same side as his right, and then you'll come back with a quick left hook. Even one that you don't have a lot of time to load up on, you'll just fire back the left hook really fast before he can get his right hand back or recover his weight. Because after he throws that right, he's going to be open for your left. And that's the real advantage at the halftime. Like I said, you're still catching the guy while he's open. You're still catching the guy while he's committed, but you are making sure that you are defended first. And the other advantage, too, is like a same-time counter requires that you already have measured the distance. You need to know how close the other guy's going to be to you. You're basically, the first contact you make with a guy with a same-time counter is the counter, right? In that exchange, the first contact you make is when you're countering him. So you need to be confident in your distance already. Halftime counters, as I said before, are great for learning the distance. You know, I tend to think of these as trigger counters. You know if the guy hits your glove that he's close enough to hit you, which means you're close enough to step in and hit him right back.
Yeah, I think that's why the most devastating same-time counters tend to be from the more experienced fighters.
Yeah.
That like Anderson Silva, classically a same-time counter kind of guy. But that's because it requires incredible proprioception, understanding hand-eye coordination, understanding of the distance, understanding where you are relative to your opponent, and they also require outstanding timing. Whereas a half-beat counter can be learned just through rote repetition, over and over and over again. They're not that's not to say that they are unskilled, but I think that they are easier to learn and easier to pull off than half-beat counters.
Yeah, and I think
than same-time counters.
Yeah, and I think they make for a useful. If you're counterpuncher or if you're any kind of fighter, it makes for a useful part of the progression of feeling your opponent out. Mm-hmm. You know, even if you are very skilled, chances are you're going to have to spend a round or two letting the guy touch you, defending yourself before countering, before you build up the confidence in his movements, before you've learned enough, you've gathered enough data about him to confidently throw mid-exchange.
Yes. So now, can we give some examples of full beat counters? I feel like full beat counters are the least common in MMA and in kickboxing. I think they're more common in boxing.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Full beat counters, to me, like the advantage of a full beat counter. I'll give an example, and this is one that can kind of be both. To me, like the quintessential full beat counter is a slip and cross. Usually, you'll counter a jab with your cross after slipping it, as opposed to the cross counter where you are throwing your cross to meet the jab. You're slipping the jab and throwing at the same time, with the head movement being incorporated into the punch. In this one, you're slipping and loading up and then coming back with your right hand. And that one can kind of be a halftime counter as well, when it's more of like a pull counter, where you're not really fully loading the punch, you're just getting your head just barely out of the way. It's just hair trigger throwing action. But quintessentially, I think it's a full-time counter. And the advantage to me of a full-time counter is what I just mentioned. It affords you the opportunity to really load up on the shot that you're countering with. So just like a half-beat counter, you're not putting yourself fully at risk like you might with a same-time counter. You are still taking care of your defense before you throw. You're making sure that you're not being hit before you make the other guy pay for missing. But you get to throw a more powerful shot than a half-beat counter. You can never, like a catch jab is a quintessential half-beat counter, particularly because it's not that powerful. You know, you're not loading up on a jab. You give it a little bit of a loading action, but if I slip to my right hip as your jab goes over my shoulder, all my weight goes onto that right foot. I'm tensing my leg, I'm bending my knee, I'm getting ready to put out that cigarette, twist the ball of my foot, and launch a right hand back at you. And it's going to be the hardest right hand that I'm capable of throwing, because my defensive movement is exactly what I needed to really get all my weight ready to commit to that shot.
Yeah, it's also, I agree with all of that. That's a really excellent point. And also, it's easier to keep your feet moving under you, I think, when you're throwing a full beat counter, because a half beat counter, it tends to fire so fast. I think it's hard to keep your feet moving under you to adjust your distance to your opponents.
Absolutely.
in that situation. With a full beat counter, you can really get your weight moving forward to track the moving target.
Absolutely, it's a great example. A great point, I should say.
So other kinds of full beat counters, if we want to expand this from just talking about punches, I think in traditional Muay Thai, in Thai style Muay Thai, we tend to see a lot of full beat counters because so much of the action takes place at long distance. It takes place at kicking range. A caught kick counter or a you only really see these in Muay Thai. The backwards slip to avoid the high kick, and then you come back with your own kick.
Yes.
Those are all full beat counters.
Absolutely. Or to me, like the one that I always liked back when I was still doing Muay Thai was to block a right kick, to check a right kick, and then to throw a switch kick and counter. Where you'll lift your leg to check, as you bring the foot back down, you switch, and you come right back as the other guy sets his foot down. You're still, because you're at this long distance, as you said, you're almost relegated to a full-time counter. And because you're countering with a large weapon of your own, you're not countering with something quick. It's not like you can maybe get a half-beat counter if you were to check a kick and come back with a teep, like without setting your foot down. That might be a half-beat kick counter. But almost all kick counters seem to be full beat, because you have to, you have to bring your leg all the way up.
It takes a long time to throw a kick.
Yes.
There are half beat counters off of checks, but they're all punch counters. They're all punch counters off of checks, right? So if you somebody throws a low kick at you, you check and you come back with a jab. So you've got your foot off the ground, then you step forward with that into the jab. That's a half-beat counter. But I would say even most punch counters off of checked kicks are still full-beat counters.
Yeah, I think so, because you have to reset your position. And also to that point, I think to me one of the classic full-beat counters, again from my days doing Muay Thai, is to do a scoop parry. We used to call this like an old-fashioned parry. I don't know if there's any truth to that or not, really. Though I do see a lot of old-school boxers doing it. And you see it more in boxing than you do in MMA, actually. or in kickboxing now, where you will parry the punch as you normally would. Normally you parry a punch under traditional modern boxing ideas. You'll parry the punch across your body. And for a scoop parry, or an old-fashioned parry, you will parry it that way and then bring it down and scoop it out. So you're actually kind of opening the guard of your opponent with this motion. And the classic one for kickboxing or for Muay Thai is to do that to the opponent's jab, and then you're scooping their jab out of the way, and you use the motion of scooping the jab as your arm torque to then throw a chopping right low kick. And hopefully you are catching them with all of their weight on their left leg from having committed to their jab.
Yeah, you see the same kind of scooping parrying motion in kickboxing and Muay Thai to parry kicks. Right, so you keep one hand. You keep the hand on the kick on the side that the kick's coming from. You keep that up to defend your elbow, to defend your ribs, and then the hand. And then the glove to defend the side of your jaw. But then the other hand comes and it scoops the kick. Yes. So all of the counters off of that are full beat counters.
Yeah, and in boxing, I see it a lot from Mexican fighters. I think for whatever reason, you don't see it from American fighters anymore. It's not slick enough, I guess. That's our love affair with slick fighting. Will be our undoing. We lose all these cool old techniques.
Yeah. So I think that covers same time counters, half beat counters, full beat counters. Are there a few counter fighters that we want to talk about in general as examples of the style?
Absolutely. I think one we have to talk about right off the bat is Juan Manuel Marquez. Mm-hmm. Because Marquez is that rare anomaly of a fighter who was taught to fight against his natural inclination and does it very well. And I think it's what makes him such an effective counterfighter. Though it has also gotten him in trouble. There's always that trade-off, right? We said on this show many times before throughout this series, it's not a good idea, generally speaking, unless you've got a guy who really knows you or you get really lucky, to learn to fight in a style that does not suit your natural temperament. And as far as natural temperament is concerned, Juan Manuel Marquez probably would have been a brawler. The man knows how to slug it out. He is not afraid to exchange. He's not afraid to swing wild. He's not afraid to get hit. And in fact, he becomes more dangerous oftentimes after he gets knocked down. It's almost like if you see Juan Manuel Marquez get knocked down early in a fight, you could probably make a bet and win money that the other guy is going to get knocked out. It's a scary thing about him, but that's how it is. And I think that is actually maybe that specific brawler's mentality is probably what makes him such a good counterfighter, because he has no fear of being in the places that make counterfighters really dangerous. He has no fear of being close enough to the opponent to be hit. He's kind of the perfect brave counterfighter. What he had to learn was the patience. He had to learn to hang back and not get drawn into a fight that didn't favor him. And it's always been something he struggled with. When he fought Timothy Bradley, Marquez chased Bradley around the ring. He came forward pretty well, actually, better than he used to do, but he ended up losing the fight. It was a close fight nonetheless, but he ended up losing because he was, his personality wanted to fight differently than his coach wanted him to. He's always gotten into trouble with Manny Pacquiao, brawling with him. And again, it also makes him more dangerous. In their most recent fight, he knocked Pacquiao out in the fourth round, because Pacquiao expected this brawl. And when people start to brawl with Marquez, that's when his long years of training as a counterpuncher make him especially dangerous.
Yeah, it's rare that you get that combination of skill and also, in Marquez's case, durability. Dude is tremendously durable, and he also packs a real punch.
He does.
So that's part of what makes him such a dangerous counterpuncher, is that not only does he have all of the skills that go along with that, he also has the natural characteristics, or the combination of natural and learned characteristics that play perfectly with his style. So we talked before about Marquez's combination punching. He is in less danger of losing a decision than guys who just want to pick you off a shot or two at a time, because he always throws his volume, he always throws in combination, but then he has the power to hurt you when you commit, when you really come in on him, and he can take your shot and come right back with it. We talked about half beat counters coming off of defensive movements. A half beat counter can also come when the guy hits you and then you just slug them right back. That is also a half beat counter.
Yeah. And I guess that's what happens when you give long training. And credit to Nacho Beristain, who is a fantastic boxing trainer. That's the man behind Marquez. He also trained Finito Lopez, and Marquez is Juan Manuel's brother, Rafael Marquez. 3 great fights. If you guys haven't seen these, check out any one of the series between Rafael Marquez and Israel Vazquez. Just tremendous knockdown, drag-out brawls. Great fights between 2 very skilled and very tough fighters. But I guess what happens when you give a guy like Marquez that brawler's instinct, that much training, you kind of gift him with a second option. You gift him with a second gear. So, like, what happens when a brawler gets knocked down? He brawls harder, right? That's pretty much what happens every time. Whether it's because he likes being hit or because he can't stand it and he feels insecure, he's going to brawl harder. That's his instinct, is to hurt the other guy more than he hurts him. With Marquez, he will often brawl until he gets knocked down. And it's like once he finds himself in trouble, that training kicks in. All that experience, all the time drilling, all that time hitting the double end bag, all that time doing this, sparring with other great fighters in Beristain's gym, that kicks in. And suddenly he keys in, he gets in the zone kind of, and becomes a dangerous guy. He really spots his targets. He becomes more patient after he gets hurt. And so it makes him a fighter who is strangely vulnerable and yet strangely effective, which also what makes him so damn fun to watch.
Yeah, I kind of wonder if eventually John Lineker won't kind of turn into a counterpuncher.
Maybe.
Because, it's weird to say this because he's nowhere near as skilled, but he kind of reminds me of Marquez in terms of what he brings to the table. Like, in terms of the punch, he's got brick fists.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of the durability, in terms of the volume, the hair trigger and the ability to throw in combination. And, like, if Lineker, who has been getting substantially more skilled, like this narrative has been lost in his this narrative has been lost in all of the discussion of his inability to make weight. But like Lineker has become much more skilled and has become much better at picking and choosing his spots. He's become much more defensively sound. And I kind of wonder if he too will eventually not turn into something more like a counterpuncher.
Could be,
because he's a brawler. Like he's absolutely a brawler. He just wants to put his fists on you, and it doesn't fucking matter how he gets there.
Yeah.
But I kind of wonder if, as he gets older and more discerning, he won't turn into something more like Juan Manuel Marquez.
Especially if he can afford to throw those combinations more often at a higher weight. If he's not gassing out, if he's not worried about reserving his energy so much. And if he's fighting guys who are bigger than him, it means they're going to come at him rather than him having to chase them around.
Yeah, it kind of makes you wonder. I don't know. Like, it's a weird discussion to go from Juan Manuel Marquez to John Lineker. But hey, what are you going to do?
I cannot wait to see him fight Sisco Rivera.
Oh my God!
I'm gonna lose my mind.
I mean, I just that's one of those fights like that just makes you cackle.
Yeah, it makes you cackle. I've cackled many times since that fight was announced. Just to go out into the street in the middle of the night and just cackle at the moon because I know the violence is about to come down.
Connor, have you ever watched Parks and Recreation? Did you ever watch Parks and Recreation?
I did.
Okay, so the Ron Swanson, the classic, the
iconic
character of Parks and Recreation, when he does his little like cackling laugh, like that's what comes into my head whenever I think of John Lineker, period, but also John Lineker, Francisco.
Yeah, in particular. Yeah.
Like Lineker is the guilty pleasure of all MMA fans, or at least he should be.
Yeah, and speaking of Sisco Rivera, that's a pretty damn good counterpuncher right there.
Oh yeah. Sisco Rivera.
As far as MMA goes, I wouldn't call him necessarily a pure example of the type, more of a boxer puncher, but he can definitely counter well.
It's quite skilled.
Absolutely.
So is there anybody else that we'd like to talk about in terms of examples of counterpunchers, or have we pretty much got it covered here?
Let's talk Salvador Sanchez quickly.
Oh yeah, we got to talk Salvador Sanchez.
P.S. By the way, everybody, I'm going to give you a little homework. Maybe I shouldn't use that term. You don't have to watch this fight, of course, but if you want to see a counterpuncher, a special counterpuncher deal with a very difficult style matchup, I recommend you watch Juan Manuel Marquez's fight with Juan Diaz, who was swarmed and pressured, and he could hit hard, and he was relentless, and he never tired. He came at Marquez and basically tried to do to him what Derek Brunson did to Sam Alvey last weekend, and you will see how special and how skilled a fighter Juan Manuel Marquez is in that despite taking a lot of shots early, he slowly learned his openings, started picking Diaz apart with precision punches, and used his combination punching, his power, and his footwork to work his way back into that fight and get an awesome knockout, I think in the 9th round. So that's definitely an example of a rough style matchup being overcome by skill and sheer force of will. As for Salvador Sanchez, you just watched his fight with Wilfredo Gomez, Pat. What were your initial thoughts having seen that?
So one of the things that we talked about a little earlier in this episode is how the pure counter fighter needs to have a command of all three of those types of counters that we talked about, the same time, the half beat and the full beat. And what immediately stood out to me about Salvador Sanchez was that he had a perfect command of all three of those. He was perfectly able to land the same time counters. He's perfectly able to land the half beat counters, to have that kind of hair trigger that we talked about, to sense the moment that Gomez's gloves touched his, that was his time to fire back, that Gomez was in range. And also the full beat counters, the ability to slip and come back with shots, to roll and come back with his shots, and that he would throw in combination too. That it wasn't one shot at a time, that it was multiple shots at a time. But so all of those things, beautiful timing, sense of the distance, but a command of everything the counterpuncher needs to be successful.
Absolutely. And Salvador Sanchez shows, I said on this show before that defense, I think I said when we talked about pressure fighters, that defense is almost more important for a pressure fighter than any other style. Because if you're going to be running towards a guy all night long, you better be able to avoid his punches, right? You've got to be able to avoid taking that damage. If you're going to be moving forward, you need to be safe while you do it, or at least as safe as possible. I think, if not equal, then the second most important time to have quality and varied defense is as a counterpuncher. You have to be able to not only make the other guy miss, but you have to do it with enough skill. You have to have enough balance, enough flexibility, and enough composure to make those movements such that you are in position to either move again or throw back after you move. If you're not in position to get off your counters, how are you going to rely on them to win the fight, right? So Salvador Sanchez is a perfect example of this. Archie Moore called this in a really good Sports Illustrated interview before he fought Rocky Marciano. He called this idea escapology, where he talked about building bridges. He talked about each position building a bridge to the next, where he's never in a position in which he can't do at least two or three other things out of it. If I slip to the left, I can either pull my head back from that position, I can slip back to my right, I can bob down and then roll under. I can move, and I can also punch. I can slip and then throw my right. I can lean my head forward and then pull and then counter with a jab. I can throw my left hook right off of that left slip. I have options, and I can pivot to the left, or I can roll under and pivot to the right. I want to be able to find these bridges and cross them at will, so I'm in position at all times, or as much as possible. And if you watch, in particular, his fight with Wilfredo Gomez, Salvador Sanchez is just a beautiful example of the value of defense to a counterpuncher's style, because there will be these long sequences with Gomez throwing at him. Sanchez could defend these punches. You think he has unreal reflexes, but he's not a particularly fast fighter. He's not like an outstanding athlete in terms of fast twitch or anything. He was very well taken care of. He was quite an oddity at the time he was fighting, because he had a doctor to measure his heart rate in his camps, not something that boxers did at the time. So, he was quite a scientifically trained fighter, but he wasn't an incredible athlete in the way that some of his opponents were. Certainly wasn't the kind of ridiculous powerhouse that Wilfredo Gomez was. But it's because he's always in position to move. He knows where he can move next. It makes it look like he has this preternatural ability to predict what's going to come at him. So he's just always balanced enough and ready to move. He also knows what he's at risk of. If he slips to his left, he knows it might be a left hook coming, so he knows what movements he's probably going to have to make next, which makes it easier to react when you have a smaller pool of options from which to draw.
Yeah, a fighter like Archie Moore, or especially Salvador Sanchez, in that fight with Wilfredo Gomez, their mind works like a flow chart, where every single position leads to an almost infinite number of other alternative positions, and each one of those positions then leads to a particular number of other positions. So you just get this endless multiplicity of possibilities, and for a guy like Sanchez, it's just impossible to deal with. What could you do to deal with that? And that was partially the brilliance of Anderson Silva too, is you never really knew what was coming next. That the mind of a counterpuncher, of a really accomplished counterpuncher, is an amazing thing. Yes. That's that is the essence of what makes combat sports great, is the sheer intelligence that it takes to fight in that style, the intelligence and the reactions and everything. It's really, really hard to do well.
Yeah,
like,
it's the science in the sweet science. Like that's the it's what makes, if we like to think of it as the science of defense or the science of fighting or whatever, that's the most scientific way to approach it. To pare down the complexity and the craziness of a brawling, a back and forth exchange, to pare down that into a tree of simple options, each of which sprouts from a number of other options, and all of which have preset patterns that you can follow, and to still make that look fluid and off the cuff, to still make it look artful in the same time, that's absolutely the best. It's just unbelievable to watch. So that's a fight you should watch. You should also watch Sanchez versus Azuma Nelson, which was Sanchez's last fight before his untimely death at the age of 23. He fought Azuma Nelson on very short notice. I don't have the number in front of me, but I want to say it was a matter of days, if not just a couple of weeks. Azuma Nelson was relatively unknown at this time. He may be unknown to you if you're not much of a boxing fan there listening at home, but he would go on after this fight to be an all-time great, especially as a pressure fighter. And he was, particularly in his early days, unbelievably awkward to deal with. Stiff. I think I described it to Pat before I began recording. I think I said there's almost a rhythm to athletic movements, where you can kind of tell when a guy tenses up before he throws, these natural tensions, these natural tells. And Nelson was always tense, always stiff, just kind of frozen in place at times, where he would throw right from that position. You couldn't tell when he was going to do something, which then made it even more difficult to tell what he was going to do next. And so and then added with the fact that he was a naturally aggressive fighter who could punch. He had a lot of knockout power. It made him a really difficult fighter. And for Sanchez to deal with him as well as he did, and it was a back-and-forth fight. It was a very brutal, difficult war for Sanchez. But he knocked Nelson down, I think, twice during the fight, and dealt with him remarkably well on extremely short notice. It just shows the value of having that strong defensive base, of knowing what position you're in, what that position's strengths and liabilities are, and what positions you can go to after it, or what punches you can throw from it. It just shows the value of that kind of thinking. You can deal with a fighter like Azuma Nelson with no preparation. Do we have anything else?
I think we've pretty well covered it. I think we may have to put that Salvador Sanchez Wilfredo Gomez fight in the body of the article on Bloody Elbow.
I think that's a good idea. Yeah, I could talk about counterpunchers all day. That's the thing, man. It's the best. It's like it makes me want to be a counterpuncher, and I suck at it.
Well, I think therein lies my fascination with it as well. So I'm just not patient enough for that.
Yeah.
Like I love to hit a good counter, but I do not have the patience to sit back with it. And for me myself, like, sparring with somebody who really likes to sit back and counter is a tremendously frustrating thing for me, because I like the pressure. And so, like, it just messes with my head. Like, there was always a guy that I used to spar with, really big, tall guy, had a karate base, and he chewed me up. He repeatedly chewed me up just about every time we sparred, because he would just run me into his counters. That was what he wanted to do. It was really hard for me to deal with. And so I find it endlessly fascinating.
Yeah. I think that's the things that give us the most difficulty are often the things that we want to learn the most about.
Yeah.
That's definitely the case with that. Anything you have coming out this week, Pat, before we wrap up here?
I have nothing coming out this week. I am
Awesome.
I am taking a pretty light month here. I'll have some big news in next week's episode. But for now, I got nothing.
Excited to hear about that. Well, on the topic of Salvador Sanchez, I should have an article on him coming out this week on badlefthook.com, so look forward to that. I also have a second part of a technique recap, the one that Pat mentioned earlier in the show, in which I looked at the outfighting of Serwan Kakai and Beneil Dariush. Now I'm going to look at the infighting of guys like Frankie Saenz, Timothy Johnson, and Jared Rosholt, stuff like that. So I'm going to look at some more close-range fighting. And then I also want to, Pat, I think we are tentatively agreed on this, correct? Our date for our live Heavy Hands commentary?
Yes, we are. We are not just tentative. We are locked in stone.
We're locked in. We are carved in stone. We're ready to go. I initially announced on Twitter, everybody, that we would probably be doing live commentary for UFC 191. Plans have changed, but we have a fantastic card that both Pat and I will be watching and calling live. I think we're going to do the full preliminary card, not the Fight Pass, but the full televised prelims and the full televised main card. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And this is the UFC Fight Night Holloway versus Oliveira on Sunday, August 23rd. It'll be a nice Sunday card, nice leisurely way to spend your afternoon. If you sometimes get frustrated by fight commentary, if you wish that there was a little more insight being offered, if you like the sounds of our voices, then you should tune into this broadcast while you're watching the fights. Let us be your proxy commentary, and we will be talking about the fights and breaking them down live as they happen. Details will be coming sooner, but I'm pretty sure we're going to be doing this by way of a Google Hangout on YouTube, either on the Bloody Elbow YouTube channel or on my channel, which is just titled my name, Connor Rebush. So we're really looking forward to that. We hope that you guys enjoy it. And then we will, of course, be releasing it afterward as well in 2 parts, prelims and main card, so that you can watch the fight back later and listen to us talk about it while it's going on, in case you happen to be like at a bar watching or whatever. Although if somebody goes to a bar, opens the Hangout on their phone, and listens with headphones while watching the fights, you will officially be my favorite person. I would have great respect for that level of fight geekery.
Yeah, that would be pretty outstanding. I don't know that we're going to have many of those, but if that's you, you're the dude in the stands at a baseball game listening to the radio broadcast. You're that guy. Like,
absolutely.
Which props? I'm not hating on that.
Mad respect, absolutely. So I think that just about does it. Thank you guys for joining us today. Hope you appreciated this special edition, extra long episode. Styles Make Fights series is just about done. I think we'll be talking more about all-terrain fighters and brawlers in some future episodes. We may have to combine those into one episode, because I'm not sure we quite have as much of a grasp on what makes those styles what they are, or even if they are styles. But we love talking about this kind of stuff. We love trying to categorize and understand the madness of fighting, and what a great episode to end the series on, with a type of fighter who does just that. They embody this scientific approach to combat. So with no further ado, let's wrap up. If you guys came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.